When Christopher Columbus first landed in the continent of North America over 500 years ago, he didn't land in the United States. He didn't even land on the mainland of the continent, actually. Most historians agree that he landed somewhere in the modern country of the Bahamas, an archipelago nation located in the Caribbean. From this point onwards, the Caribbean became a crucial territory for the European powers and their colonial endeavors, with the first modern permanent European settlement in the Americas being established there. The demographics of the region were changed forever after European contact and has fluctuated greatly over the half millennia since it was discovered, and today is probably one of the most racially diverse areas in the entire world. There is a rather large diaspora of people from contemporary Caribbean countries in many parts of the world, ranging from Western Europe to the United States and even other parts of Latin America. And although most people seem to think that all Caribbeans are of African descent, this isn't even close to being true. The original inhabitants of the Caribbean islands were composed of various Native American or Amerindian groups, such as the Taino, Arawak, and Carib people, with the name of the region actually having etymological origins in the latter group. At the time of first contacts with the Europeans, it's believed that the entirety of the Caribbean, which stretches from Cuba to the far northwest to Trinidad to the far southeast, had anywhere from 500,000 to perhaps 2 million native inhabitants. Unfortunately, because of exposure to new diseases as well as hostile relations with the Europeans, the overwhelming majority of the native Amerindians were either wiped out or absorbed into a new racial group through mixing with the Europeans. After only a century with contact with the European powers, the number of pure-blooded Amerindians in the Caribbean had dropped by 80 to 90%. From then up until the late 1600s, the majority of the Caribbean islands were predominantly European in origin, believe it or not, with thousands migrating from the various European colonial powers that owned the islands, especially the Spanish, French, and British. Nations that are almost entirely black today, such as Barbados, were nearly 80% white until the 1600s, when mass importation of slaves from Africa were funneled into the area. New arrivals came not only from Africa, but after the Revolutionary War in colonial America, hundreds of loyalist families from the United States that fought for the crown were allowed to settle in the Bahamas, and many of these families brought their slaves with them. By the 1800s, almost every island in the Caribbean was majority African, with the exception of Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the island of Hispaniola, now split into the modern-day countries of Haiti to the west and the Dominican Republic to the east. The African slaves did mix with the Europeans on occasion, and even with the native Amerindians of the region, if they managed to escape captivity. The region today can be divided into approximately 4 subregions, with the Greater Antilles in the west being comprised of Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico, the Lesser Antilles in the east being comprised of hundreds of smaller islands such as Trinidad, Barbados, and the Virgin Islands, and countless others, the Lucayan Archipelago in the north, made up of the country of the Bahamas, as well as the British territory of the Turks and the Caicos Islands, and lastly, the ABC Islands in the south, being made up of the Dutch overseas territories of Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao, hence the name ABC. And this lies just above the coast of Venezuela. Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic are the only areas that speak Spanish today. Haiti, Martinique, and Guadeloupe are all French-speaking, with the latter two actually still being overseas territories of France, and the language of Haiti actually is rather divergent from French spoken in metropolitan France and is known as Haitian Creole. Most of the rest of the region speaks English, although in many cases the language has divulged into Creole status, meaning that the language has evolved into something rather unintelligible to most English speakers, such as Jamaican patois. Imagine a person speaking with such a heavy Jamaican accent that you couldn't even understand them, and then sprinkle in a few words that aren't even English in origin, and you get your Creole language. Probably most fascinating of all is the language of the ABC Islands, Papiamentu, which is actually a mix of Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, and English, with vocabulary from various African loanwords. Although Dutch is still the official language of these islands because it is a Dutch territory, almost everyone there speaks Papiamentu, despite it being the only area on the planet where it's spoken. The islands have not only a unique language, but racial makeup as well, with the majority of the Papiamentu population being a blend of European, African, and Amerindian ancestry. People from the island of Aruba tend to have more European and Amerindian DNA, while people from Curacao and Bonaire tend to have more African DNA. The majority of Cuba and Puerto Rico both identify as white, being around 67 and 75% respectively, even though the definition of white is a bit different in Latin America, and anyone with around 70 to 80% European DNA or higher would normally identify as such, despite the average white person in America being over 98% of European origin. There's also a significant European minority in the Dominican Republic and various islands of the Lesser Antilles. About 70% of the population of the Dominican Republic identifies as mixed race, having a composition of about 60% European, 30% African, and 10% Native American DNA on average, although in some areas, Dominicans will almost never identify themselves as black, since there's a strong correlation between black and Haitian, and there's a lot of resentment towards the Haitians who occupied their half of the island for a couple of decades, actually, in the 1800s. After the complete abolishment of slavery in the region in the mid to late 1800s, colonial powers scrambled to fill the work gap left over after their African slaves were liberated from the plantations. And instead of turning to Africa or Europe like they used to, this time they set their sights on the Asian continent. Hundreds of thousands of workers from the Middle East, India, and China were being imported into the region over the years to do the work of the former slaves, and, if we're being honest, at around slave wages. Today, around 1% of Cuba's population is of full or partial Chinese descent, with many other islands having significant Chinese minorities, such as Jamaica or Trinidad. Trinidad is currently the only Caribbean island that has an Indian plurality, with around 40% of the population having origins in the Indian subcontinent. It's also very common to find people of mixed descent on the island called Dubla, being half African and half Indian, although a very large percent of people of African descent on the island also have at least some European and Indian DNA. Many islands of the region from both the Greater and Lesser Antilles also received a large amount of immigration from the Levant, that being the region including Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, although the majority of these early immigrants were overwhelmingly Christian and mostly assimilated into the white, black, or mixed race population. Virtually every other island of the Caribbean has a predominantly Afro-Caribbean population, although the admixture in each varies greatly, with Jamaica having a very large percentage of its country's genome originating in Europe, with Haiti being the first country in the region to gain independence, having what can be described as the closest to a pure-blooded African society, with around 80 to 90% of its population being black, and about 95% of the DNA of those that identify as black coming from Africa, compared to only 75 to 80% for modern black Americans. Adding all this together, you get a racial makeup for the entirety of the Caribbean being about 36% black, 29% white, 2% Asian, and the remaining 33% being of some other multiracial origin, making it perhaps the most racially diverse region in the world. Most people know that the two main hotspots for Caribbean immigration to the United States are located in Miami and New York City. But there's actually an entire region that's populated by people of Caribbean descent located in a stretch of land on the southeast coast. The region on the coastlines of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida is called the Gullah Coast, named after the Gullah people, an ethnic group distinct from modern black Americans and actually having origins in the Caribbean country of the Bahamas. A group of Bahamian slaves were brought to the coast in the 1800s, and after the slaves were freed, they created their own culture, and even to this day, many Gullah speak a Creole language related to Bahamian Creole. There's also an old and expansive diaspora of Afro-Caribbeans on the eastern Central American coast, stretching from Belize to Panama. Around 30% of Belize's population today is of Afro-Caribbean origin, being a blend of Jamaican, Barbadian, and Trinidadian immigrants, although the percentage was much higher in the past, and it wasn't until recently with mass mestizo immigration from the surrounding Hispanic countries of Guatemala and Mexico that their racial demographics were changed. The Bay Islands, the largest of which being Roatan in Honduras, are mostly populated by Afro-Caribbeans, although a surge of mestizo and Euro-Honduran immigration from the mainland is starting to dramatically change the racial composition much in the same way as Belize. There is also an immense Afro-Caribbean population on the coast of the Central American countries of Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and especially Panama, who imported large numbers of Jamaicans and others from the Lesser Antilles to work on the Panama Canal. There's a large stretch of coast in Honduras and Nicaragua called the Mosquito Coast, which is populated by the Mosquito people. They have an extremely interesting history since they actually originated in the Lesser Antilles as an Amerindian Carib group, but ended up mixing with escaped African slaves, creating their own distinct ethnic and racial group. This group later moved to the Central American coast a few hundred miles away and became the British protectorate of the Mosquito Kingdom, although they were later dissolved and absorbed by the Hispanic nations of Nicaragua and Honduras. One of the most fascinating regions on the planet, demographically and historically, has got to be the region of the Guyanas on the northern coast of South America. This consists of the countries of Guyana and Suriname, as well as the French overseas territory of French Guiana, which technically makes it the last remaining European colony on the mainland of any continent outside of Europe, with every other European overseas territory being an island. Guyana has a very similar demographic history to Trinidad, which is a bit to the north, being mostly African in origin, until the arrival of Indian migrant workers called coolies. Suriname was actually the only Dutch colony on the mainland of the Americas besides New Amsterdam, or modern New York City, and has an African plurality with significantly large minorities from not only South Asia, but Southeast Asia as well, with almost 14% of their population originating from Indonesia. Also important to note is that Suriname has the largest percentage of a Muslim population, being about 30% of any country in the Western Hemisphere. French Guiana is a bit of a mixed bag. It's extremely difficult to find accurate statistics regarding race, ethnicity, or religion in the territory, since taking data on any of those factors is actually illegal in all of France, which is pretty stupid if you ask me. Most likely, though, around 50 to 60% of French Guiana's population would be Afro-Caribbean, with significant minorities of white Frenchmen, mulattoes, and other multiracial groups. So I really wish I could talk about these latter two regions of Central America and the Guyanas more, but I'm running out of time here. The video's getting pretty long, and they'd make good topics to do entirely separate videos on, so keep an eye out for that. So that's the demographic history of the Caribbean, which is truly remarkable to say the least, and please let me know your thoughts on the Caribbean in the comments, other than it making a great vacation destination. Let me end with a poem from Trinidadian writer Cletus Ali, better known as the Mighty Dougla, being born to an Indian father and African mother. If they send in Indians to India, and Africans back to Africa, well, somebody please just tell me, where they send in poor me, I am neither one nor the other. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. So if they send in all these people back home for true, they got to split me in two. Thanks for watching, everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.